Picture this, a tiny nation smaller than the state of Indiana, with barely 1 million people, suddenly conquers the world's oceans and builds an empire spanning 3 continents. Sounds impossible, right? But Portugal did exactly that in the 15th century. And here's what nobody tells you. It wasn't just courage or luck. The Portuguese had a secret weapon, a revolutionary technology so powerful that it transformed them from a small European kingdom into the world's first global superpower. Today, I'm revealing the hidden innovation that changed history forever. But before we dive into this incredible story, do me a favor. Smash that subscribe button and hit the like. Trust me, what you're about to discover will blow your mind, and you won't want to miss future videos like this one. Let me take you back to the early 1400s. If you were looking at a map of Europe, Portugal would seem like the least likely candidate for world domination. I mean, seriously. This was a country squeezed into the western edge of the Iberian Peninsula, with Spain blocking their access to the rest of Europe and the vast, terrifying Atlantic Ocean to their west and south. The Portuguese had no natural resources to speak of, no gold mines, no silver, no precious gems. Their economy was basically fishing and agriculture, hardly the foundation of an empire. Meanwhile, their neighbors in Spain were richer and more powerful. The Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa controlled Mediterranean trade. The Ottoman Empire was expanding and blocking traditional land routes to Asia. So what did Portugal have? They had desperation and they had vision. You see, in medieval Europe, wealth came from trade with Asia. Spices, silk, porcelain, all the luxury goods that European nobility craved. But there was a problem. The traditional trade routes went through the Middle East, controlled by Muslim powers who charged outrageous prices. By the time a bag of pepper made it from India to Europe, it had passed through so many middlemen that it was literally worth its weight in gold. The Portuguese looked at this situation and thought, what if we could bypass all these middlemen? What if we could sail around Africa and reach India directly by sea? Everyone thought they were insane. The African coast was known as the Green Sea of Darkness. Sailors told stories of boiling oceans near the equator, of sea monsters, of waters so treacherous that ships would simply disappear. Nobody knew how far South Africa extended, or if it was even possible to sail around it. The idea of reaching India by sailing west, around an entire continent, was considered suicide. But the Portuguese had something that nobody else had at that time. They had a systematic approach to solving this impossible problem. And that brings us to one of history's most underrated geniuses. Enter Prince Henry the Navigator, one of the sons of King John I of Portugal. Now, Henry never actually sailed on these voyages himself. That's a common misconception. But what he did was far more important. He created what we might call the world's first research and development center, a place where science, technology, and exploration came together in a way that had never been done before. Around 1418, Henry established his headquarters at Sagres, on the southwestern tip of Portugal. This wasn't just a palace or a military base, it was an innovation hub. He brought together the best minds of his time, mathematicians, astronomers, cartographers, shipbuilders, and experienced sailors from across Europe and beyond. Christians, Muslims, Jews. It didn't matter. If you had knowledge, you were welcome. Think about how revolutionary this was. At a time when most knowledge was guarded jealously, when guilds kept their secrets close, Henry created an open environment where people shared information and collaborated. It was like the Silicon Valley of the 15th century, except instead of coding software, they were coding the secrets of the ocean. What were they working on? Everything. They were studying astronomy and mathematics to improve navigation. They were collecting and analyzing every map they could find, including Arabic and ancient Greek sources. They were interviewing every sailor who came to port about currents, winds, and coastal features. They were experimenting with different ship designs, testing what worked and what didn't. And here's what's crucial. Henry funded expedition after expedition down the African coast. Not just one or two ships, but a systematic campaign that lasted decades. Each voyage pushed a little further south. Each captain was required to bring back detailed information about what they found: the coastline, the currents, the winds, the people. This information was added to their growing database of knowledge. Most of these voyages failed by conventional standards. Ships were lost, sailors died, and they didn't find gold or glory. But from Henry's perspective, each voyage was a success because they learned something new. They were chipping away at the unknown, piece by piece, turning myth into data. In 1434, one of Henry's captains, Gil Eanes, finally passed Cape Boyador, a point on the West African coast that sailors had feared for generations. The waters there were treacherous, and superstition said that no one could pass and return, but Eanes did it, and he came back with information that demystified the danger. Once one ship made it, others followed. But the expeditions alone wouldn't have been enough. The Portuguese needed technological breakthroughs, and the greatest of these was a ship design that would change naval history forever. Let me tell you about the Caravel, because this ship is the real hero of our story. If you've ever seen pictures of Columbus's ships, the Nina and Pinta were caravels. You know what I'm talking about. But the genius of the Caravel isn't obvious just from looking at it. Before the Caravel, European ships fell into two basic categories. You had the square-rigged ships, which were great for sailing with the wind, but terrible at sailing against it. These ships were basically pushed along by the wind, like a leaf on a stream. Then you had lateen-rigged ships, common in the Mediterranean, which could sail closer to the wind, but were smaller and less stable in the rough waters of the Atlantic. The Portuguese, working through decades of experimentation at Henry's Innovation Center, created a hybrid design that combined the best of both worlds. The Caravel had triangular lateen sails that allowed it to sail much closer to the wind, a technique called tacking. This meant that even if the wind was blowing in the wrong direction, a skilled crew could zigzag their way forward. This was revolutionary. But that's not all. The Caravel was relatively small and lightweight, typically only 50 to 70 feet long, which made it highly maneuverable. It had a shallow draft, meaning it didn't sit deep in the water, so it could explore rivers and coastal areas where larger ships would run aground. Yet it was still sturdy enough to handle ocean storms. The Caravel was also designed for long voyages. It was efficient, requiring a smaller crew than larger ships, which meant supplies lasted longer. The design maximized cargo space relative to the ship's size. And here's something most people don't realize. The Caravel was fast. These ships could outrun most others of their time, which was crucial not just for exploration, but eventually for protecting their trade routes from competitors. Think about it this way. If exploration was like space travel, the Caravel was the Portuguese spacecraft, specifically designed for the mission of pushing into unknown waters and actually making it back home. But a great ship alone still wasn't enough. The Portuguese faced another massive challenge. Once you sailed out of sight of land into the open ocean, how did you know where you were? How did you find your way back? This is where Portuguese innovation in navigation science became crucial. Imagine you're a sailor in the 1400s, and you've just sailed south along the African coast for weeks. You're further from home than anyone in your country has ever been. The coastline is unfamiliar, you can't see any landmarks, and if you don't figure out exactly where you are and how to get back, you and your entire crew will die at sea. This was the reality Portuguese sailors faced, and it required a revolution in navigation. Before the Portuguese, European navigation was mostly coastal sailing. You stayed in sight of land and used landmarks to know where you were. If you crossed open ocean, you relied on dead reckoning, estimating your position based on your speed, direction, and time traveled. This was incredibly imprecise and got worse the longer you sailed. The Portuguese transformed navigation into a science. They adapted and improved the astrolabe, an instrument originally developed by Greek and Islamic astronomers. The mariner's astrolabe was a simplified version specifically designed for use at sea. Here's how it worked. You measured the angle of the sun at noon or the North Star at night above the horizon. This angle told you your latitude, how far north or south you were from the equator. This was groundbreaking. For the first time, sailors could determine their position even in the middle of the ocean with no land in sight. They created tables showing the sun's position throughout the year, which made these calculations possible. Portuguese navigators became masters of celestial navigation, but there was still a problem: longitude. Determining how far east or west you were was much harder because it required accurate timekeeping, and reliable clocks didn't exist yet. The Portuguese developed techniques to work around this, using a combination of dead reckoning, latitude sailing, and careful observation of currents and winds. They also revolutionized cartography. Portuguese mapmakers created charts that were accurate and detailed in ways that previous maps weren't. They developed the Portolan chart style, which showed coastlines with remarkable precision and included compass roses and rhumb lines to help navigate. Every expedition brought back data that made the maps better. And here's what's really important: the Portuguese kept these maps secret. This was classified information, state secrets that gave Portugal a massive competitive advantage. They deliberately published false maps to mislead competitors while keeping the accurate ones locked away. The combination of the caravel, the astrolabe, advanced cartography, and systematic data collection gave Portugal tools that no other nation possessed. They had turned ocean exploration from a desperate gamble into a calculated science, and they were about to prove it in the most dramatic way possible. For decades, Portuguese ships inched their way down the African coast. Each expedition pushed a little further. They established trading posts, they learned about the winds and currents, they mapped the coastline. But they still hadn't answered the crucial question: did Africa have an end? Could you sail around it? By the 1480s, Portugal had invested generations of effort and vast amounts of wealth into this project. Some people in Portugal thought they should give up. After all, they'd been sailing south for over 60 years and still hadn't found the end of Africa. Maybe the skeptics were right. Maybe it was impossible. Then in 1488, Bartolomeu Dias changed everything. Dias commanded a fleet of 2 caravels and a supply ship. He sailed south past the furthest point any Portuguese expedition had reached. He kept going, pushing into waters no European had ever seen. Then something happened that must have terrified his crew. They hit a massive storm. For 13 days, the storm drove them south and west, away from the coast and into the open Atlantic. When the storm finally passed and they turned back east, expecting to find the African coast, there was nothing but ocean. So they turned north, and that's when they realized what had happened. They had been blown around the southern tip of Africa without even knowing it. They had done it. They had found the way around Africa. Dias called the southern tip the Cape of Storms, which honestly seems like a more accurate name. But when he returned to Portugal and reported his discovery, King John II renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, because now there was hope of reaching India. But completing the journey to India would take another decade. In 1497, Vasco da Gama set out with a fleet of 4 ships. He followed Dias's route around the Cape of Good Hope, then continued north along the east coast of Africa. There, he found established ports where Arab and Indian merchants traded, and he hired a local pilot who knew the way to India. In 1498, Vasco da Gama arrived in Calicut on the southwest coast of India. He had done it. A Portuguese fleet had sailed from Europe to Asia entirely by sea, cutting out all the middlemen. The economic implications were staggering. The spices that da Gama brought back to Portugal sold for 60 times what the expedition cost. 60 times. Suddenly, Portugal had direct access to the most valuable trade in the world. But da Gama's voyage wasn't just about one successful trip. It was proof that Portugal's system worked. The ships, the navigation techniques, the maps, the decades of accumulated knowledge. They could do this repeatedly and reliably, and they did. Once Portugal had the route to India, they moved with stunning speed to establish a global empire. We're talking about a nation with around 1 million people competing against powers with 10 times their population. How did they do it? The answer is a combination of naval superiority, strategic thinking, and, let's be honest, ruthless efficiency. First, Portugal established a series of fortified trading posts along the African coast, around the Indian Ocean, and throughout Asia. These weren't large colonies requiring massive armies. They were strategic choke points. The Portuguese controlled Malacca, which controlled access to the spice-producing islands. They controlled Hormuz, which controlled the Persian Gulf. They established Goa in India as their Asian headquarters. Their strategy was simple but brilliant. Control the sea routes, not the land. They didn't try to conquer vast territories inland. They built forts at key ports, controlled the shipping lanes with their superior ships, and forced everyone who wanted to trade in the Indian Ocean to do business with them or face their cannons. And about those cannons, Portuguese ships were the first in the Indian Ocean to carry heavy artillery. The caravel and its later evolution, the carrack and the galleon, were essentially floating fortresses. Local powers had never seen anything like them. In 1509, the Portuguese defeated a combined fleet from Egypt, Gujarat, and Calicut at the Battle of Diu, establishing naval supremacy that would last for a century. Meanwhile, back in the Atlantic, Portugal was also building an empire in the Americas. In 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral, sailing to India, was blown off course and landed in Brazil. Portugal claimed this vast territory, which would become one of their most valuable colonies. By the mid-16th century, Portugal controlled the most profitable trade network in history. Spices from the East Indies, sugar from Brazil, slaves from Africa, silk from China, porcelain, textiles, all flowing through Portuguese hands. They established trade connections from Japan to Brazil, creating the first truly global economy. Lisbon became one of the wealthiest cities in Europe. Ships loaded with treasures from around the world arrived in Portuguese ports. The King of Portugal controlled wealth that rivaled any monarch in Europe. A tiny nation on the edge of Europe had become a superpower. But here's what I find most remarkable. This entire empire was built on technology and knowledge. Portugal didn't have the largest population or the biggest armies. What they had was better ships, better navigation, better maps, and a systematic approach to solving problems. They had invested in innovation, and that investment paid off in ways that transformed the world. Now, Portugal's dominance didn't last forever. By the late 16th century, Spain, England, and the Netherlands were copying Portuguese technology and challenging their monopolies. The Spanish absorbed Portugal temporarily through royal succession. Other powers learned to build caravels and use astrolabes. The secrets couldn't stay secret forever. But the impact of what Portugal accomplished echoes through history to this day. First, Portugal proved that systematic innovation works. Prince Henry's approach of gathering knowledge, testing ideas, learning from failures and iterating designs, that's the foundation of modern research and development. The scientific method, the idea that you can solve problems through systematic observation and experimentation, was dramatically validated by Portugal's success. Second, Portugal created the template for European global expansion. Once they proved it was possible, everyone else followed. The age of discovery, colonialism, the Columbian exchange, all of this flows from Portugal's initial breakthrough. For better or worse, Portugal connected the world in ways that had never happened before. Third, The technology Portugal developed became the foundation of global navigation for centuries. The combination of the Caravelle ship design, the astrolabe, accurate maps, and celestial navigation remained essential tools until the invention of modern GPS. When Columbus sailed to America, he used Portuguese navigation techniques. When Magellan circumnavigated the globe, he used Portuguese knowledge. He was Portuguese himself, actually, though sailing for Spain. Fourth, Portugal demonstrated the power of information and knowledge. In an age when most competition was about armies and territory, Portugal won by knowing more than anyone else. They understood the winds and currents, they had better maps, they had ships designed for their specific mission. Information was their ultimate weapon. And finally, there's a lesson here about the power of persistence and long-term thinking. Prince Henry started this process around 1418. Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498. That's 80 years, generations of effort before the payoff came. Most ventures would have been abandoned as hopeless, but Portugal kept going, learning from every failure, incrementally improving until the impossible became real. Today, when we use GPS to navigate, when we study oceanography, when we look at detailed maps of the world, we're using knowledge that started with those Portuguese sailors pushing into the unknown 6 centuries ago. When companies invest in research and development, when they create innovation hubs where smart people collaborate across disciplines, they're following the model Prince Henry created at Sagres. Portugal's story is a reminder that small nations can punch way above their weight through innovation, that systematic approaches to solving problems can overcome what seems impossible, and that knowledge and technology are the ultimate sources of power. The hidden technology that enabled Portugal to dominate the oceans wasn't just one invention, it was a system of innovation, a commitment to learning, and the courage to keep pushing forward when everyone else said it was impossible. So now you know the secret. You understand how a tiny nation on the edge of Europe became the world's first global superpower, and you know that it wasn't magic or luck, it was technology, persistence, and systematic innovation. But here's my question for you. What modern parallels do you see? Are there nations or companies today following Portugal's playbook, investing in technology, thinking long-term, and positioning themselves to dominate the future? Are there lessons from this story that apply to your own life and goals? I want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let me know what stood out to you from this story. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into history and technology, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit that subscribe button, because I've got more stories like this coming, stories about the hidden innovations and forgotten breakthroughs that changed our world. Also, help me out by sharing this video with someone who loves history or anyone who's working on something difficult and needs inspiration. Portugal's story proves that with the right approach, even the impossible can become reality. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we uncover another incredible story from history. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and remember, the world belongs to those who are willing to push beyond what everyone else thinks is possible.